Gracias, Diana. Es el año 1972. Angela Davis ha salido hace poco de prisión. Perseguida desde 1969 y declarada por el FBI como uno de los 10 criminales más buscados de Estados Unidos, es detenida en 1971 y condenada a la pena de muerte en 1972. Sin embargo, la masiva campaña internacional logra su libertad 6 meses después de estar encarcelada. La mujer que pisa Santiago es un ícono de la lucha antirracista de los años 60, y no solo es negra, también comunista, feminista y líder del movimiento Pantera Negra. Comillas, cierren los ojos y piensen lo que significa ser mujer, ser negra y ser comunista, escribe Ángela. Las fotografías la muestran junto a Tencha Allende, rodeada de gente y recorriendo las calles y sindicatos en este pequeño país al sur del mundo que ha desafiado las leyes de la Guerra Fría, eligiendo a través del voto a un presidente socialista. Ángela tiene 26 años y acude a un lugar como este espacio, a juntarse con estudiantes, con profesores, dirigentes sindicales, mujeres y hombres que repletan la Universidad Técnica del Estado para escuchar a esta mujer negra, de cabellera voluminosa y desafiante, que simboliza un tiempo, una lucha, todas las luchas de todos los tiempos. Las fotografías capturan ese momento. En los rostros de esos jóvenes que la admiran hay sonrisas, hay esperanzas. Es el año 1972 y todo parece posible. La libertad de Angela Davis y la vía chilena al socialismo. Nacida en la ciudad de Birmingham, Alabama, fue la mayor de 4 hermanos en el seno de una familia culta. Sus padres eran maestros y activistas de una organización que luchaba por los derechos civiles de los afroamericanos. Comillas, a los 4 años me di cuenta que los vecinos de enfrente eran distintos de nosotros, aunque todavía no era capaz de asociar aquella diferencia con el color de piel, escribe Ángela en su libro Autobiografía, traducido a varios idiomas y con múltiples ediciones desde que fuera publicado en 1974 a sus 28 años. Para mí, prosigue, lo que nos distinguía de los demás vecinos era la mala cara que ponían al vernos, su costumbre de mantenerse siempre lejos de nosotros y de no responder cuando les decíamos buenas tardes. Casi inmediatamente después de nuestra llegada, los blancos se reunieron y decidieron establecer una frontera entre ellos y nosotros. La calle Center sería la línea de demarcación. Si nos quedábamos en nuestro lado de la calle, se nos dejaría tranquilos. Si pasábamos a su zona, nos declararían la guerra. Mi padre tuvo que esconder unas escopetas en casa y prepararse a vivir en continua vigilancia. Cierro comillas. Gracias a una beca, Ángela viaja a Nueva York a continuar sus estudios secundarios. Mientras es una adolescente, sus lecturas, su inquietud intelectual y su activismo la conducen a militar en una organización juvenil marxista. Luego ingresa a la Universidad Brandé en Boston para estudiar lengua francesa, graduándose con los máximos honores. Esa beca universitaria incluía una estancia en la Sorbona, en plena lucha anticolonialista, cuando para toda una generación Argelia no era solo el nombre de una colonia francesa, sino un llamado a la independencia y a la libertad. Luego de graduarse en la Universidad de Brandé, pasó 2 años en la Facultad de Filosofía en la Universidad de Goethe en Frankfurt. Luego en la Universidad de California, donde conoció a Marcuse y de la que fue expulsada por ser militante del Partido Comunista gracias a una cláusula vigente del tiempo del macartismo. Más tarde volvería para dictar clases en el programa Historia de la Conciencia. Discípula de Marcuse y estudiante de Adorno y Habermas, acerca de su formación filosófica y la relación con el activismo político, Angela Davis señala en su libro, comillas, Democracia de la Abolición, Prisiones, Racismo y Violencia, de Ediciones Trota, Madrid, 2016, que la filosofía proporciona una posición de ventaja, comillas, desde la cual hacerse preguntas que no pueden ser planteadas dentro del discurso científico que tanto presume de conformar las estructuras dominantes de comprensión de nuestro mundo social. Y añade, Herbert Marcuse me ha enseñado mucho acerca de la relación entre filosofía e ideología crítica. Ha supuesto una especie de inspiración su obra Contrarrevolución y Revuelta, en la que intenta teorizar directamente sobre los desarrollos políticos de finales de los 60, pero manteniendo al mismo tiempo la estructura filosófica. ¿Cómo podemos imaginar un mundo mejor y llegar a formular las preguntas que nos permitan ver más allá de lo dado? se interroga Ángela, afirmando que somos capaces de producir resultados mucho más fructíferos cuando la reflexión filosófica entra en diálogo con otras disciplinas y con otros métodos. Feminista y teórica del tema, en su libro Mujeres, Raza y Clase, se interroga acerca de la invisibilización de las luchas y reivindicaciones de las mujeres negras por el feminismo blanco liberal, proponiendo una alianza transversal que critica las exclusiones de raza, género, clase y sexualidad, en una relectura radical y transformadora del feminismo. En las últimas décadas, su trabajo intelectual y político está centrado en lo que denomina, comillas, el abolicionismo de la prisión, que incluye la abolición de la pena de muerte, la abolición de lo que denomina el complejo industrial penitenciario y la abolición de los rastros y herencias de la esclavitud. En ese contexto, y a partir de las expresiones de la comunidad negra en las calles como reacción a los asesinatos de afroamericanos a manos de la policía, como la del movimiento Black Lives Matter, las vidas negras importan, Davis señala, comillas, no podemos asumir que el racismo es sobre todo un problema para aquellos que lo padecen. El racismo distorsiona y corrompe instituciones y mentes, cierro comillas. Activista en la lucha por la liberación de los presos políticos, vocera de la iniciativa de boicot, desinversiones y sanciones al Estado de Israel, a los 50 años de la creación de las Panteras Negras, si bien señala que la historia no se repite y que las condiciones de hoy son diferentes, Angela Davis sigue aspirando a una sociedad libre de jerarquías raciales, desigualdades raciales o violencia racial. Es el racismo lo que debemos expulsar de nuestras sociedades, ha dicho. Angela Davis está aquí, en el Teatro de la Universidad de Chile. Han transcurrido 44 años para su retorno al país. No sabemos qué pasó con los rostros capturados en las fotografías que dan cuenta de su primera visita al país en el encuentro masivo en la Universidad Técnica del Estado. Quizás muchos ya no están. Tal vez algunos fueron encarcelados, torturados, desaparecidos o exiliados. Pero lo que sí sabemos es que a 26 años de recuperada la democracia, en Chile los jóvenes de hoy luchan por derechos sociales que creíamos conquistados, como el derecho a una educación pública de calidad, derecho a la salud, a circular por las calles sin control de identidad, derecho a la información plural y diversa o a abortar sin ir a prisión. Son derechos que esos jóvenes que en 1972 saludan a Angela Davis en la Universidad Técnica del Estado sí tenían garantizados. No está claro si el Chile de esos años es mejor o peor que el actual. Lo que sí es evidente, como señala Angela Davis, es que las luchas pasadas no pueden corregir las injusticias actuales y que son las nuevas luchas las que lograrán revertir las nuevas injusticias. Gracias, bienvenida Angela Davis. Te esperamos.
Buenas tardes. Thank you very much. First, I would like to acknowledge, as activists try to do in the US and elsewhere, and as the very moving opening ceremony urged us to do, that we are convening on colonized land. And so I would like to pay tribute to the Mapuche, the original inhabitants of the land on which we meet. It is not only important to encourage historical memory, but also to recognize that the consequences of colonization continue to oppress indigenous peoples today. If we believe in justice, equality, and freedom, it is our responsibility to engage in material practices of solidarity with indigenous peoples today. It is a great honor to be able to participate in the 10th Encuentro of the Hemispheric Institute. And I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to Deanna Taylor for having invited me. It has been enlightening and inspiring to attend performances and presentations, and I can say that I was especially moved by Alfredo Jara's presentation last night and the way he helped us to discover hope in the most unmitigable and disheartening circumstances. He certainly demonstrated why we need artists to point the way to the future. I appreciate the invitation to participate in the Encuentro, and I'm especially happy to be able to visit Chile. Chile, 44 years after I first came here to thank the people of Chile for their inestimable contributions to the struggle for my freedom. I have had the opportunity to Recoleta and the Población Angela Davis. And I cannot tell you how inspiring it was to witness the art, the collective enthusiasm, and the overall determination to fight for a better life. I had not really expected to feel so moved. I was also very moved by my meeting with the Federation of Students of the University of Chile. And of course you saw the 1972 meeting at the Technical University. To meet with the students and a number of student feminist groups, and was happy to add my voice to the struggle for free abortion. Aborto libre. I first visited Chile, as you heard, in October of 1972. I had been acquitted and released a few months earlier. As a matter of fact, I was acquitted on June 4th, 1972. It was a time full of hope. The Cuban Revolution, the African Liberation Movement, the Vietnamese were resisting US militarism. The victory we experienced in my case was cause for celebration. Today, people often ask me how I would like to be remembered. I suppose you reach a certain age, and that is the question that is posed to you. And my answer is always that I'm not really that concerned about how I'm remembered as an individual. I'll be gone. But I would like people to remember the movement that made it possible for me to walk free. And let me talk for a moment about that era. With respect to what one might call global revolutionary temporalities, it was a very hopeful time. But in the United States, it was a time of conservatism and anti-communism and repression. We interpreted that repression as an attempt on the part of capitalism by its political figures to prevent the inevitable, to prevent the advent of global liberation. Despite the fact that this may not have been was not an accurate reading of the times, we did experience important political victories during that era, including the forced resignation of Richard Nixon. But let me recapitulate for a moment the circumstances of my case. As I said, Richard Nixon was president. I was in jail in California where Ronald Reagan was governor. Certainly looking forward to a trajectory that would lead him to the White House. And J. Edgar Hoover was director of the FBI. Some would have described this triumvirate as the most powerful political force in the world. And of course, with that combined force, they were pursuing me. I was charged, as you heard, with 3 capital offenses. I stood to be sentenced to death 3 times. Many people who were convinced of my innocence at that time believed, nevertheless, that it was impossible to score a victory against this triumvirate. However, and this is what I hope people will remember, with the aid of a global movement, an international movement, we were victorious. Remember, this was a time of communist internationalism. And as critical as we might be of the then socialist community of nations, it is important to recognize how people joined hands around the planet and said no to a capitalist future. In the campaign for my freedom, there were communists, there were socialists, there were trade unionists, there were people of faith from churches and synagogues and mosques and Buddhist temples, there were students, there were athletic clubs, there were sororities and fraternities, virtually every aspect of civil society, including here in Chile, was represented in the campaign for my freedom. And we won. We won. Today, people sometimes refer to me as an icon, which I really don't like. But I've come to recognize that my image circulates as a witness to that collective people's power. It is this movement that I hope people will remember. I hope they will remember that against insurmountable odds, against the most powerful political figures in the world, we won. We won. But we realized that that was also a period of retaliation and revanchism, the most obvious example of which was the CIA-backed coup against Salvador Allende and the Unidad Popular, during which, and as a result of which, kidnapping was normalized and torture. The life of Victor Jara and the lives of so many others were claimed. The image of the detainees inside the stadium will remain forever etched on my memory. And so we would begin a very long campaign of solidarity with the people of Chile. And so we learned how to say, el pueblo unido jamás será vencido. In this current period of global capitalism, unrestrained privatization, neoliberal ideologies, which people here in Chile are very much acquainted with, we need to carry with us the lessons of the possibility of victory. Freedom is a constant struggle. This is the title of my most recent book, and that title is drawn from a freedom song that was repeatedly sung in the southern United States during the mid-20th century freedom movement. Freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. We have struggled so long, we must be free. We must be free. The other verses of the song evoke crying and moaning and sorrow and dying. They say that freedom is a constant dying. We've died so long, we must be free. And I like the irony of the last line of each of the verses. We've struggled so long, we've cried so long, we've sorrowed so long, we've moaned so long, we've died so long, we must be free, we must be free. There is both critique and inspiration. We must be free, we must be free, but are we really free? This song, it seems to me, was designed to forge community. Freedom emerges from the very process of struggling. As we attempt to achieve freedom, we discover other dimensions of freedom. We transform our suffering, our sorrow, our moaning, our dying, our pain into joy. This song reminds us that the activist work of those who continue to campaign for the freedom of political prisoners, against the prison industrial complex, against capitalist and heteropatriarchal institutions and ideologies, can never move forward except in arenas created and recreated by artists. This is why I so appreciate the themes of this encuentro, which emphasize the interconnectedness of art, performance, activism, scholarship. The theme of my talk is prison abolition to Black Lives Matter, social movements and the global struggle for justice. The campaign to abolish imprisonment as we know it has a very long history. It emerged at the intersection of many struggles. The struggle against police violence, which in the US stretches all the way back to the era of slavery and its aftermath. The struggle to free political prisoners in the US and throughout the world. Anti-racist struggles, anti-capitalist movements, environmental movements, LGBTQ movements, feminist movements. Thus, the abolitionist movement is a very capacious movement. It recognizes, for example, that prisons are gendering apparatuses, and that to abolish imprisonment as we know it is also to abolish the policing of gender. Trans prisoners and former prisoners are thus playing an important theoretical and practical role in building the movement against the prison industrial complex. The abolitionist movement is rooted in the struggles of the 1960s and 1970s, the period I evoked in the discussion of my own case which I use to preface these remarks. But importantly, we are now observing the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party, which was founded in 1966. And yes, thank you. And remember that the Black Panther Party was founded by young people who were resisting police violence in the community and by people who were opposing the disproportionate incarceration of Black people and people of color. In the aftermath of the death of Trayvon Martin, in 2012, the Black Lives Matter hashtag was created. And it eventually grew into a network, especially in the wake of the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, 2 years ago. The message of the Black Lives Matter movement is that Black lives are not abstract and fungible lives that can be subject to repression under the sign of the universal equality of human beings. The Black Lives Matter movement challenges the tyranny of the universal. There's something very important and powerful that Black lives offer. Histories and temporalities and languages and aesthetics and possibilities of freedom. And of course, it was in the Caribbean that this tyranny of the universal was first challenged by the Haitian Revolution. If we examine the struggle against slavery in this hemisphere, we know that in every important movement there were resonances with the Haitian Revolution. The insistence by women and men who came to call themselves Haitiens, that to be human is to collectively struggle to be free. There is no such thing as the freedom of a single individual. We know that freedom, as it has been conceived under bourgeois democracies, has always been a limited freedom, a freedom accorded to racial, class, and gender elites, a freedom that acquires its value precisely through its practices and powers of exclusion, race, class, gender, sexuality. There are many now in the US who insist, and I'm not going to name any names, but I assume you know who I'm speaking about. There are many who now insist that instead of proclaiming that Black lives matter, we should argue that all lives matter. Do they not realize the extent to which such universal proclamations have always boasted racism? More often than not, universal categories have been clandestinely racialized. Any critical engagement with racism requires us to understand the tyranny of the universal. For most of our history, the very category human has not embraced Black people, people of color, indigenous people. Its abstractness, its very abstractness has been colored white, and it has been gendered male. See the 1981 collectively edited anthology from the US that is entitled All the Women Are White. all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. If indeed all lives mattered, we would not need to emphatically proclaim that Black lives matter. Or, as we discover on the Black Lives Matter website, Black women matter, Black girls matter, Black gay lives matter, Black bi lives matter, Black boys matter, Black queer lives matter, Black men matter, Black lesbians matter, Black trans lives matter, Black immigrants matter, Black incarcerated lives matter, Black differently abled lives matter. Yes, Black lives matter. And if Black lives matter, Latino lives matter, and Asian American lives matter, and Native lives matter, Indigenous lives matter, Muslim lives matter, poor and working class white people's lives matter. At this moment, we are experiencing the revenge of history and the strike back of those who call for such achievements as making America great again. So we are rising up again, and we are calling for an end to racism in the institutions of policing and punishment, in the institutions of education. The demands for the abolition of policing as we know it, the abolition of prisons as we know them, no longer seem like the crazy formulations of misguided idealists. Such demands are beginning to make a great deal of sense. And this is within the context of stronger calls to end the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And Black Lives Matter activists and advocates are calling for justice for Palestine. Justice for Palestine, immigrant rights from North America to Southeast Asia to Africa and the Middle East are emerging as pivotal issues. Thus, we're also witnessing the limits of limited citizenship and are compelled to raise the meaning of global citizenship, and thus to challenge the extent to which the nation state always appears to create barriers around our ideas and our struggles. What might it mean to imagine a future in which nationalism and the nation state no longer loom so large? We're called upon to raise the age-old questions of capitalism and slavery, as did Eric Williams. We're called upon to understand the intentional underdevelopment of the third world in accordance with the theories of Walter Rodney. And yes, there is a strike back from the state. A young woman by the name of Jasmine Abdullah, a queer Black Lives Matter activist, was just recently convicted for having attempted to prevent the arrest of one of her comrades. What was the charge? This is in the state of California, and not the California of Ronald Reagan, but this is 40 years later. She was charged with felony lynching for participating in a demonstration. You know, I said that there were certain figures whose names I didn't necessarily want to evoke, but it seems I may have to, because I think it is so important to recognize the extent to which Donald Trump and the campaign to move him in the direction of the White House has revealed the depth of racism in our society. How deeply white racism and white rage resides in certain populations in the US. And I think that we are beginning to recognize that we will have to do everything within our power to prevent the election of Donald Trump. It will spell disaster for the world. This is our responsibility to the planet. Because we would like to be able once again to imagine democratic futures. Democratic futures, we are beginning to recognize, will not be based on the assimilation of communities who have been marginalized by existing structures of what we call democracy. And if one thinks about all of the strategies for the last half century or longer, have been strategies of assimilation. Assimilation into existing states of affairs have never fully brought us progress. Progress with respect to democracy and freedom have only ever occurred with the challenging and reimagining and restructuring of institutions and discourses and knowledges. Revolutions, whether they be political or scientific or discursive, are always dependent upon a willingness to let go of what seems most natural, of what seems most normal, of what seems most comfortable. And we have learned major lessons from indigenous peoples throughout the world who have never called for assimilation, but have rather called for justice and sovereignty. And I think that as we develop our strategies for struggle during this period, we have a great deal to learn from the struggles of indigenous people. Speaking of assimilation, I want to conclude my remarks with a simple example from the United States. I don't know whether you are aware, but we are involved in a discussion about placing a woman's image on our paper money. No woman's image has ever appeared on the bills of various denominations. So it's argued that this is the time to make the shift. And so I was recently asked whether I was happy to learn that Harriet Tubman's image may very well displace Andrew Jackson's image on the $20 bill. And of course, I rushed to support any attempt to address U.S. historical amnesia, historical absent-mindedness, by asking us to think seriously about the role of slaveholder Andrew Jackson, who orchestrated many Indian removal campaigns. But to simply replace him with abolitionist Harriet Tubman, who is one of my heroes, to simply replace him with her image is to ignore the role that capitalism plays and played in sustaining slavery and settler colonialism and racism more broadly. This assimilationalist stance does not permit us to consider other possibilities. Instead of further legitimating the role of money by affixing Harriet Tubman's image to the $20 bill, imagine the possibility of abolishing the centrality of money altogether. In other words, by imagining a world in which what is most needed by living beings could not be so easily transformed into commodities. And this is indeed the meaning of the prison abolitionist movement. We call not simply for the abolition of the institutions of punishment per se. We are demanding the creation of a society which no longer relies on institutions such as prisons for security. And therefore, the call for the abolition of prisons is a call for free housing, free health care. It is a call for free education. And of course, if what is most needed by human beings could not be so easily transformed in a commodity, this might very well mean that education would no longer be commodified. And so therefore, we would have tuition-free education and free health care, free mental health care, an end to homelessness and affordable housing for everyone. And this would be the beginning of the democratic and hopefully socialist futures we all deserve. Muchas gracias.
Pablo va a sacar el micrófono.
Gracias. Gracias. Vamos a comenzar ahorita una conversación con Angela Davis y yo le voy a preguntar la primera pregunta acerca exactamente del tema que están hablando ustedes. So, Angela, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you something which I think has to do with what people are saying here. And it had to do with something that you were talking about in your talk. You were talking about the strategies for struggle and how we can think productively about the strategies for struggle. So we heard about the Mapuche woman. We heard about the feminicide in Colombia. We have heard of the student movement, and we've heard of Black Lives Matter and all the movements that we're all involved in. And so Brazil is another case. This is Nicaragua. Ayotzinapa. Pero por favor, déjenos nomás preguntarle una pregunta que va en nombre de todas estas cosas para ver qué nos dice Angela Davis acerca de esto. Entonces, so my question to you is, there's always this tension between the struggle right now in a particular place and these much broader struggles that we see people naming. So we have all the particularities, and then we have this massive struggle, which kind of brings back to mind this idea of the 99%, right? That 99% of the people on this earth are struggling and are experiencing violence and are involved in some kind of a struggle. So what are the strategies for unifying all of these different struggles that you can think of? Because obviously we've had a very hard time coming up with productive ways of working together for social justice and change.
Well, we are always engaged in particular struggles. But for too long, many have had a myopic approach, assuming that their struggles are the most important. And I like to quote Elizabeth Martinez, a Chicana activist, who pointed out long ago that we should never engage in oppression Olympics. We should never become embroiled in arguments about whose struggle is most important, because all of our struggles have value. And so it seems to me that a feminist approach is one that recognizes the interconnectedness, the intersectionality of all struggles. And while we are engaged very specifically in struggles for the freedom of political prisoners, I have been involved in struggles that have attempted to develop a broader consciousness of prison abolition, injecting a feminist consciousness into that struggle. We recognize that it is against the backdrop of all struggles for justice on this planet. And that, as a matter of fact, when I think about what is happening in South America and the deterritorialization of indigenous people and of people of African descent, Afro-Colombians, for example. I've been involved in the campaign to prevent the people of La Toma from being evicted from their land in order to make way for mining concerns to mine the gold that resides inside the mountains where they live. And it seems to me from each struggle we draw lessons that help us all, that encourage us to do the work we're doing, whether we're engaging in campaigns against femicide, whether we're involved in movements to end intimate violence, whether we want to try to create an arena that will allow us to more optimistically imagine the possibility of a socialist future. We do all of this work together. It is all interconnected. The environmental movement, for example, is ground zero of social justice movements. We can do nothing if we cannot save this planet. And of course, it is indigenous people who teach us how to engage in the kind of practices of biodiversity and love for the earth that will help us to move toward a livable future. And so I find it absolutely wonderful that people have voluntarily shared some of these struggles with the audience that is gathered here today. We are all in this together.
Thank you. The forces of capitalism, the forces of the media, the educational for-profit system, the correction system, the police systems, we have all of these institutions that are very successful at keeping us apart and keeping us at each other's throats, as if we were each other's problems, and as if the systems of power themselves were not to blame. So my question and my own personal struggle in my work and my life is to figure out how do we bring people together in productive sharing of strategies and creating these spaces where we see that there's solidarity. We see that there's a lot of other people like us who have the same issues, the same preoccupations. And I'm just wondering, in your experience and lifetime as an activist and as a scholar and all the things that you do, how you recommend to many who feel that they're very alone in their struggles to take not just comfort, but also some kind of way of communicating with others who can share and can help, develop these strategies that you're talking about.
Well, I think organizing is really important, and oftentimes we don't take seriously the art of organizing. There is no formula for bringing people together. It has to happen in the process of engaging in the practice. And, one might call, as St. Clair Drake did, the knowledge that arises out of practice, the epistemologies of praxis. And because women have most often been the on-the-ground organizers, that work is often not valued. It's not acknowledged. I always like to point out that with respect to the experiences of the U.S., when we think about the Black freedom movements, there's a figure who comes to mind, and that's Dr. Martin Luther King, right? Everybody knows Dr. King. But people are not aware of the extent to which women, poor Black women, poor Black women who were domestic workers, who were maids, who were washerwomen, they are the ones who are responsible for the Montgomery bus boycott, which was the pivotal moment in the development of the Southern Freedom Movement. And we don't know how to acknowledge the collective work that leads to the emergence of struggles and people coming together. It's about a collective imagination. It's about being able to, it's about people being able collectively to imagine a world better than the one we inhabit. And that occurs when people come together. It occurs as a result of the interventions of artists. And I always point out that without artists, we would never have a sense of where we might be going, because artists teach us how to imagine. And our imagination in this neoliberal era has become so privatized, to use Gayatri Spivak's notion of the privatization of the imagination, that we find it very difficult to imagine a state of affairs different from the circumstances that surround us at the moment. But there is no formula. It has to be done. It's on-the-ground work. It's everyday work. And I had a wonderful meeting with I thought I was meeting with a few students from the Federation of Chilean university students. I was expecting about 5 or 6 or 7 students, and a huge number of students showed up, the majority of whom were women, including trans women. And we had this amazing conversation, and it was clear to me by the interventions and by the questions that they posed that they are doing the work. And a lot of the work consists in knowing how to pose the right questions. I mean, that is what a critical engagement in our struggles is all about. But let me stop now. I can continue.
I'll just ask one more thing, that I was inspired by one of the participants at the Hemispheric Institute this year, who I guess I'll embarrass by naming, who is Shuno Lopez, who is a Mayan philosopher and activist. And one of the things that he's taught me and that I've learned from him and from the Zapatista community has to do with a kind of a radical unlearning, and thinking that we have to start with a different epistemology. Does it not place the quote, as you were saying earlier, the tyranny of the universal, this universal, unmarked but always white male at the center of knowing, and thinking about how we can unlearn this system of the individual as the center of knowing and place human beings back into an ecosystem that is much more complicated and has many, many more living beings. And so how do we begin to unlearn patriarchy? How do we begin to unlearn individualism and the capitalist need to accumulate and to convert into objects? So I think it's a radical education that we don't have schools for it. Our schools are doing the opposite, right? So I don't know, I think we should do a summer camp for unlearning or a radical, a different epistemology. He calls it the epistemology of the heart, right? That is a place of memory and a place of knowing and a place of affective connection. But anyway, would you be part of our summer school?
Absolutely. And a very important aspect of that approach, which is unlearning, consists in doing critical ideology work. Oftentimes we think of ideologies as discourses and ideas and concepts that are out there that we challenge. But we often don't recognize the extent to which they shape us. And they are internalized. And they're not only in our modes of cognition, they have embedded themselves in our emotions. As a matter of fact, yesterday during this wonderful conversation, we were talking about gender violence and how prison abolitionists have recognized that the that simply putting a perpetrator of gender violence behind bars does nothing to eradicate the entire phenomenon of violence against women and gender violence. As a matter of fact, if one examines the fact that over the last 45, 50 years, we have created so many institutions to address rape and sexual assault and battery. I, of course, remember a time when police would not even respond to a case of battery. They would say, oh, this is private. This is a domestic affair. That's where the whole notion of domestic violence, the domestic sphere, which is not subject to the public political sphere. And so this, you know, I was saying that that we have to find other ways. We have to imagine other kinds of other ways of forging justice. So what would a non-retributive justice look like? And so this young woman was saying, well, if somebody engages in that kind of violence, the only thing I want to do is kill him. And so I said, well, but wouldn't that be contributing to the cycle, to the reproduction of violence, which is exactly what happens when the only efforts to address those who have committed horrendous acts of violence against others, and we're talking about gender violence in particular, that they're put in prison, into a violent institution where they more than likely become more violent because the institution itself helps to reproduce the violence that is visited on women and others. And so we were talking about the fact that that impulse to kill, that impulse to get back, that impulse to hurt is the impulse of the state. That is exactly what the state does. And how can we acknowledge the fact that we are deeply implicated in so many of the tragedies because we do not necessarily recognize how important it is to unlearn those impulses and to try to imagine a process of justice that would be healing, that would help all of us, that would help to create a society, communities that don't rely on violence. We have a long way to go before we get there.
A lot of summer schools.
A lot of summer schools. But I think we have to start talking about this. And this is part of what it means to bring people together. We engage in the kinds of conversations, not only within the explicitly political context, but wherever we are. There's work that we can do on a daily basis to help create the possibilities of communities of resistance that have their eyes on livable futures.
Thank you very much. Let's end on that note of livable futures and a commitment to work towards the creation of more livable futures. Join me, please, in thanking Angela Davis.